how expensive can this process be? And you need to have an understanding for it, right? So today, I mean, look, in the end, we are currently very focused on tactical processes, right? And that's what I'm not sure how many decades this goes back. We were first said, okay, we do BPOs, right? We outsource transactional tasks so that we can work on the more value-based tasks. So that came as a cost. We had an understanding of what we are paying for that today. So now that is type of work that you partially now uh, change over to agents. But are you sure that your agent is cheaper doing that work than what you're currently paying a human to do? And so then it becomes just a question, no, not just, it becomes a question of timing and quality. So I
Yeah.
think it opens a whole another realm, and also goes back to that architecture piece. We are developing an operating model where humans and agents interact and are responsible for different tasks, but it also becomes a cost equation.
Thank you so much for joining another edition of The Never-Ending Climb for Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. Today, I have the great pleasure of being joined by Marc Behring. And Marc loves driving transformations and is a procurement excellence leader. Great background. Thank you so much for joining us today, Marc.
Thank you for having me, Sean. Happy to be here.
So you've talked about how procurement needs to become more like an enterprise system architect. And what I love about that is you've got the understanding of technology in the business. And that's a really powerful combination. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I think it always depends, obviously, on the maturity of the company that you work with, right? So for us, it's so that IT is really focused on our core ERP, which is SAP, right? But the business, so we in procurement, we own Coupa, right? So our sales team owns Salesforce. So basically, whatever is closer to the user is owned by the users already, right? But now with the technology changing, now I need to be even more active in trying to understand and define for myself from within procurement, how is my tech stack looking and how is it developing, right? So if we talk about agent to agent communication, now all of a sudden I need to become basically an expert in what's MCP and how do agents actually talk to each other and how do we make that real within the architecture and the framework of the systems that we work with.
I love it. I think the idea that everybody's bringing agents out. SAP's got them, Coupa's got them, ServiceNow, all of the procurement technology, supply chain technology providers all have agents. You and I were just at DPW recently, and you couldn't meet somebody that their company wasn't already magically AI native. And
Everything is agentic. Everything is agentic.
sell me this pen. It's agentic. And I think there's enterprise platforms. So it's very rare for any business to have just a single platform. But I also know that there's a lot of leaders, certainly in the last year, that you get overhear saying, how many agents do you have? And it's completely the wrong question. How would you encourage people to think about where those agents sit and what they're allowed to do?
Yeah, I think going back a little bit in the past or the present for most of us, right? So you have to think about how do you integrate systems, right? So how do I connect Coupa with SAP so I can bring information both ways? Then we went into this space where we had, okay, now we have best of breed software, almost like standalone, right? So you had a software that was really focused on really good and doing one thing. But now we have to layer the element of the AI agents on top of that, or between, rather, right? So and you have a point there. So Coupa has Navi, and then SAP has Joule. So everybody develops their own agents. But then we also know, and we saw in DPW, you have all the other people now having agents, right? So how do you then layer them in top or between your core platforms? And I think in terms of how we should be thinking about is really to better to formulate an agnostic layer, right? So nobody forces me to use the Coupa native agent or the SAP native agent. They both announced early in May that they will be open to other agents that can access their data through their tools. And we now are in the job, and that's again to that earlier question: how do we become enterprise architects? We are now in the job to define how that's going to look like. So, do I create my own agents within my own corporate environment and my own IT? Right? Do I go with third party agents as a service? Are they specialized? Are they generic? So we now have to define how this layering is going to look like. And then in terms of what we allow the agents, that's where we throw in, we're basically creating a new type of organizational model or operating model, bring it in basically in agentic workforce, right? So now, as the in good old, I spent 8 years in consulting in business transformations, the good old end-to-end process definition, RACI model. So now you not only layer humans and what they are doing, now you layer what the agents will do and which processes they're responsible for and what they can do in that context.
Absolutely. I think that idea of the process map often had a box that said this happens, but now you get to go and double click on that and find the 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80% of that that can now be automated or done by an agent. I think the idea that the entire box can be completely done by an agent in some cases is possible. And then in some cases, I mean, we can't hold an agent accountable. So we still need to have key decisions at certain points made by that human that actually is genuinely making a decision. But it doesn't necessarily still need to be in the same department, because you may now be able to enable the end business user to go and understand and follow the policy and the process and everything else, and no longer need somebody in another team to go do 12 steps for them, because those 12 steps may be done autonomously. Like the fundamentals of lean engineering, if it doesn't create value for the customer, it's waste. It's tremendously clarifying in the, are we reimagining a process, or are we making the digital form of the paper run where there's limited benefit other than potentially rekeying it?
Yeah, and I think this is exactly the way to think about it, right? So I think you have basically three tiers, right? You have the tier of the AI agent doing it on their own. It's for now where we are with the technology, mostly our transactional tasks. And that's why it's so important to have very well and streamlined processes. So you never get away from that. Then you have the middle tier where you have the human in the loop. So because we have the defined handover points where you want to bring in the human again for an exceptions for decision making. And I think then you have human-led where the AI agents can support you doing your everyday tasks, right? So think about negotiations. I know there's a lot of vendors out there that we've also seen that are focused on negotiation AI, but in the end, I always say procurement will remain a people business, right? We talk to our stakeholders, we talk to our suppliers, and we are in the lead there. But obviously, with the technology, it can help us not only deploy the negotiation frameworks, but then also collect the information, prepare the information so we can utilize it within those negotiations. So I think that's those three-tiered lever, from fully automated, human in the loop to human-led, that we can think about contextually.
I love it. There's something really important you said there, Mark, and that is that, it's people. And two agents will have no gut feel about whether or not the other party in a potential business transaction is somebody that you would want to do business with, or somebody that you want to make sure your wallet's still there after you've shaken their hand. And I think that contrast is tremendously powerful and clarifying in the degree within which enterprises, especially, or any business, allows an autonomous system to go and find and select and purchase something with potentially no other evaluation. And I think that idea that the risk becomes the level of automation now lets somebody who sort of had a cool website that said they did it, and then they had some nice brochures that said they did it, and they submitted a quote that said they could do it at a great price, and then suddenly the quality is just not there. And so the level of autonomy that we introduce being managed by how have we identified, validated, and made sure that the human relationship and the trust is still there. This continues to be, I think, the superpower for people in business, that we can automate so much of the admin, but that initial gut feeling is so powerful.
And it's also focused on the front end, right? Because if you think about everything we talk, it happens on the front end of the business, but then your materials still need to show up at the side, or if services are provided, they still need to be executed in a way that they're acceptable to you. And again, it is people doing that for now.
Yes.
We do a lot of construction, right? So the foundation doesn't pour itself, and who does monitor if the foundation is well poured? So you start at the beginning with the contract negotiation, you talk about pricing and all the other things, but in the end, on the execution layer, you can't send the agent out to control what's being done, right? Not today, at least.
Yeah. And I think even in our lab, being able to go through and validate, quality inspection using imaging, things like that are interesting, but they're just at the edge of what most businesses are ready to contemplate. I think the other piece that comes into it is the pace of change and how much change can an organization actually digest in a given period is one of the other pieces that is a constraint in how quickly we can adapt these. I think you're probably seeing or feeling some of that because I know you're leading a lot of your peers in even just your thinking, let alone the execution.
Yeah, and we started with something what you would consider fairly simple. So we started with an agent that supports purchase requisitions. So you can now take a quote that you get from the supplier and drop it in there. It automatically creates your requisition for you, at least on the draft.
Exactly.
And we had people actually not trusting the process, which is
Yeah.
interesting, and talking about adoption, right? So we poured all the work in trying to get it up and running, and then we gave it to the organization, and then people said, "Well, do I trust this?" So in the beginning, we had a lot of people creating drafts, but they didn't finish the drafts, and so it was a little bit interesting. So it needed more communication and more assurance because it's a brand new technology. You don't have a lot of people yet interacting with AI agents to really make people feel comfortable. So in the end, it is again change management, people business, even if you use technology to make sure people embrace it the way that you intended it to.
And like any new intern or new junior employee, it takes time for somebody to trust that agent with a progressively more sophisticated level of responsibility. And that only comes when it's earned. And every model change, every upgrade is kind of like you've just potentially lobotomized that agent. And so need to go and revalidate, retest carefully. And it's a type of system that companies are just starting to get used to. I think the trust that comes from working with something and the level of reliability needs to start approaching that 4 or 5 sigma level of reliability before people are really ready to trust it. Because I think you're probably seeing some of that same thing. If you have a 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 error rate, then even that 1 in 100 at the enterprise level is not acceptable for something that just needs to be fully trusted and autonomous.
Yeah, and that's a good point you made there. Cooper had a guest speaker from Stanford actually, and they were talking about exactly the point. So how reliant are the agents today? You know what? Because what you want them to be is consistent, right? And so they talked about it. It's almost your 2080, just slightly different. So they say if you put effort in to really put all the guardrails in there, really inform the agent about how you want it to act, you can get to 70% repetitive behavior. If you really put in the extra
Yes.
effort, you're maybe at 90%. At least that's what recent studies suggest. So you still have 10%. So if you're
Yep.
talking 5, 6 sigma, we're still far away from that, right? So not to scare people, but to be a realistic to where we are today and
Yeah.
what we can do. And this is why it doesn't matter if it's Coupa, SAP, I'm pretty sure Oracle and others do it too. If you see those architecture sketches right now, you always, and I had to learn a new acronym, you always have human in the loop. So HITL or
Mhm.
however you want to pronounce it, they all
Yep.
put this little box in there. So that's not going to go away anytime soon. But then again, we don't know. I mean, if we would have this chat 2 years ago, I don't think that we would have believed in what we are talking about now. So I don't know where it's going in the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. The balance between the probabilistic and the deterministic is really what we need to make sure we're grounded in, because the deterministic systems that we've relied on for years are 5, 6 sigma reliability. Mainframes are even greater than that. It's part of why they were so successful. And I think that's why there's still some of them that are out there running today. That has a long way to go for the probabilistic agents that we're running today. And there's a variety of different ways that you can exceed. It takes work, but you can achieve today, a 4 or 5 sigma reliability with the probabilistic ingredients, but not exclusively. And I think that's really where the combination is, that harmony of the probabilistic and the deterministic working together. And that's really where the unlock happens. There's a developer joke rolling around of, how did you check if somebody searched for something 5 years ago and a developer would, run like a regex search, or they'd run a pattern search in what was entered. And then most developers today would say, well, call the LLM and ask the LLM, did this exist in, and it's not correct, right? It's starting to approach the idea of like everything, if you hold a hammer, a lot of things start looking like a nail. But sometimes you need to use a different tool. And using the right tool at the right timing is one of those pieces that I think a lot of folks out there are just starting to dig into. So being able to ask that question of how reliant on the probabilistic is this process or this, I'll call it agent in air quotes, and then how much deterministic logic is really built in to harness that. So the other word that you'll hear is harness, right? And that's either the harness that you use to build or the harness that you use to run. And so one more ingredient that you'll hear, but human in the loop, so important.
Yeah, and I was going to say, like as we talked about, system architects. So now we are again, and you have to understand the technology you're using, right? In the past, to your point, you used systems that were pre-programmed that somebody else guaranteed that they would work and they would work consistently because it's hard-coded process with a 1 and 0 logic. We are now in a different
Yes.
type of model or system, and we have to understand how it works.
Yeah. Confidence ratio is one of the magic terms that is a critical ingredient. And making sure that you understand the difference between a 1 and a 0 and a confidence ratio is really the key to unlocking that. And so a little bit of homework for anyone listening that hasn't gone to look into that. This agent sprawl is something where it's very easy to end up with 5 agents to convert PRs to POs. And it's not necessarily wrong to have 5, but you want to make sure you understand why there's 5, not 1. What are you seeing and how are you thinking about agent sprawl?
I think as we mentioned in the beginning, right? So currently you see that all our big providers are developing their own agents. We are still in a fixed fee, fixed price model for our software licenses, right? You're still paying by the seat or however that commercial model looks like.
Not for much longer.
Exactly. So now we all of a sudden need to think about tokenization. We need to think about the cost that arises with it and how that's going to work like. And I mean, the announcements were already made that, commercial models are shifting. They want to renegotiate how the contracts look like. Something that I would expect coming at us as early as the end of this year. And we have to then define based on that for ourselves how this can look like. But to answer your question, to go back to the question of the sprawl, is yes. So that's what we are seeing, and everybody's trying it out, and it's for free, and you have early user access, or we extend it for free until the end of the year. So that's the messaging now. It's going to change, and so I think it's a little bit of a bait, right? So they try to draw you in, and once you're committed, like then it's hard to get back out. But I think that goes back to the question how much more technical decisions now become in procurement on the system side is that we need to think that through ourselves. To the question is, so do we need to set out our own MCP server? Do we need to deploy our own agents and our own infrastructure that to then have them access the system? So to be independent from the big providers and also to potentially manage costs. And so that's an active process we are in. And then you still have the best of, well, I don't think we call it best of breed now at this point anymore, but you have basically, and we saw the DPW, you have so many different providers now offering S2P agentic AI platforms, or at least set out to do. So now you have a third party, basically agent as a service, right? So between all those players, how do we layer that? So that's the question. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think that's all the things you need to consider. And you want to control the spend that you eventually have. And I think the only way to control this, well, it's twofold. It's you do it yourself. Or you be, and that's another role that procurement will get that is new to the category buyer or the IT software spend, is how does the contract look like for those tokenization? What models do you use? Do you use the frontier models? Do you use earlier models? So it opens a whole another can of worms that all of a sudden we are thrown at, both as users, but then also as the professionals in procurement, where our organization expect us to be able to talk to have those negotiations with those software vendors, how we formulate the contracts and how do we make sure that we control our OPEX, right? So not just our stakeholders, we are reporting to the CFO. The CFO also has a keen interest that our budget doesn't run away from us. So there's a lot of things now, coming up on the horizon, but they're going to be here quicker than we think they will, or that we hope
A
for.
couple of ingredients, a couple of things I would add to that is especially around pricing as you move to consumption based, it's very easy to end up with kind of a credit, right? The key math that keen IT procurement professional would need to understand is if that AI credit, as an example, or workload credit includes the LLM on the AI model, then really make sure that they understand the markup because there's only a handful of companies that actually make the LLM models and or the large language models to LLM model, the model. But there's only a handful of companies that are really making those, and they're broadly commoditized, and they've converged so tightly. The open source models that are trailing the leading private frontier models are now fundamentally 3-6 months behind in terms of their capabilities and their scores on these benchmarks. So one of the key ingredients that I would encourage anyone that's looking at a contract, I recognize the irony, Mark, because of course we offer Rio and we offer a consumption-based pricing. But what I would encourage anyone to really look at is, number one, can you bring your own model, right? The models themselves are commoditized at the open source level and at a premium at the frontier model. Now, those frontier models you probably want for select things. You get into picking the right model for the right task. So the planning and strategy, but now the actual workload does not need a frontier model. So now what you get into is being able to, even within an individual, I'll call it agent, or within an individual function, make sure that you can direct the workload to an appropriate model. So it's not about, are you a Claude company? Because even Claude offers multiple different, or Anthropic offers multiple different agents or different models that you can call depending on the task. You wouldn't ask Haiku to go and help you with strategic questions, but you could ask one of their leading top-end models to go help you with those things. And so you, at the same time, you don't want their leading frontier model being used to go and read every PDF that you might send it for a quote, because that would be prohibitively expensive. So I think that the ability to fine tune that and not just get kind of lost in a generic credit is really important. So I would encourage anyone that's out there to consider the contrast between the model itself, of which there are many, and now you can run more of those yourself, because that's really something that is now, in many cases, just approaching the cost of compute. If you really look at the difference between Gemini and Anthropic, there's some really powerful combinations there. And then I think if you want to double click, and this is maybe a little further down the rabbit hole, Mark, but then get into, can you bring your own model? Because the markups on some of those markup on some of those tokens can look like SaaS margins. So you could end up in a situation, and some of those very large vendors are already doing exactly that. The cost of the LLM token is then marked up and repackaged as an AI credit at 2, 3, 4x the cost of what you can go and get that same LLM token yourself. So those are the rabbit holes that I would encourage folks to be really careful about. And then you can separate the LLM, which is broadly commoditized, from the harness that runs it, right? From the combination of deterministic and probabilistic calling, so that you can get a much more powerful outcome that way. And then you don't end up locked into a consumption-based contract where you pay $1 million and hopefully you use most of it. So those are a few of the different types of things that I would encourage folks to look at really carefully. There's a lot of companies that have signed up for the $1 million a year consumption deal, and they're only using a third of it, right? So it's hard to justify a return on that. What would you add as the procurement excellence leader, more from the procurement side? What would you add to that to help round out our discussion of buying tokens in 2026?
Yeah, I think where it relates to, and you mentioned that, is the question, what models do you use for which process or which type of task, right? So I think the other thing we need to think about is then also governance, right? So as we build those agents, right? So for example, I mentioned earlier the requisition agent, right? So somebody needs to decide. Now we did it through a third party side that wasn't yet in the realm of the possibilities, but if you build it yourself or you work embracing what Sean just alluded to, right? So what type of model should that agent use today? But then also it will change over time as those models come out every couple of weeks or month. but someone needs to make the decision.
Exactly.
How expensive can this process be? And you need to have an understanding for it, right? So today, I mean, look, in the end, we are currently very focused on tactical processes, right? And that's what I'm not sure how many decades this goes back. We were first said, okay, we do BPOs, right? We outsource transactional tasks so that we can work on the more value-based tasks. So that came as a cost. We had an understanding of what we are paying for that today. So now that is type of work that you partially now uh, change over to agents. But are you sure that your agent is cheaper doing that work than what you're currently paying a human to do? And so then it becomes just a question, no, not just, it becomes a question of timing and quality. So I think it opens a whole other realm,
Yeah.
and also goes back to that architecture piece. We are developing an operating model where humans and agents interact and are responsible for different tasks, but it also becomes a cost equation.
Yes.
And how do we optimize this whole space comprehensively? So yeah, it is much more than just the question about the tokens, but they have a space because, well, how do we forecast budget? How does it impact OpEx, right? So I don't know yet, but we need to be very aware and very wary about it to make sure we manage it the right way as we go in the future.
And a pro tip, never set up an LLM call without a cap on it. Ever. I think there's been some horror stories of some runaway AI costs for more than one company. So always set a cap to limit the number of tokens that can be used. It's very, very, very easy to accidentally end up with something in a loop that gets very expensive very quickly. Maybe just
Sure.
one last thought, Mark, to help land the plane, as we're starting to run out of time here today. But where would you draw the line? Where would you encourage somebody to consider the line between AI agents that recommend and those that really execute or decide?
Yeah, and it goes back what we had briefly touched on earlier is really this three-tiered layer that I would see today between, what we just talked about, the most transactional task, where today, if you talk about a BPO environment, you have SOPs, so you have a very clear process path, decision points, handover points, escalation points. So it's perfect, right? So it's an end-to-end defined process that you can hand over. Um, it's not really involving usually decision making. And I think that's where we go then in the second tier. So we talked about human in the loop. So that's where this becomes relevant, right? So as soon as I hit an exception or I need to loop in the human for a decision. So think about it. You don't want to give an agent DOA at this point, right? You don't want to give them delegation of authority to commit to a budget, right? So you still want to have a human in there. And I guess it would be an interesting discussion who owns it in your company, with the treasurer or somebody else, to say, okay, let's bring AI agents in the DOA matrix. That's going to be an interesting discussion. So tier two, human in the loop, if it's about decision making, committing to things, and then it's tier three, where we'll really use the agentic AI to help us do our job. Think negotiations, right? You can get an advantage there if you have agents set up to support your negotiation process. You still need to be the front face, but it can deliver all the things that you would have otherwise spent weeks or months to prepare for in terms of negotiation strategy. Looking at your past relationship with the vendor, about all the things that you want to anchor on. How do you want to influence by price, by quality, by other elements, and to prepare all that for you so that you can go into this negotiation much more prepared than you maybe ever had been, right? Instead of just going in there and just haggling price and forth and back. Now you can have a much more broader view of all the information that the agentic is to pull from all over your different systems and experience to then be prepared. So that's a couple of examples with those three layers that how I'm thinking about it. And they need to be very well defined, right? So whenever you start using the AI, you need to define those points. Actually, little side note and fun story: as we started prepping our first agents, we actually had the problem we didn't have enough things on paper. So you need to give it guardrails. And we've fallen into the hole where we said, oh, we know all those things. They're all in somebody's hand, but we've never formalized them. So how do you now hand that information over to the agent? It can't magically read your mind and execute them. So we're actually in the process of implementing it and basically writing things up to say that's the way how we want to do those things to then put
Yeah.
it in the model, right? So that's I think that's what it depends again on where you are from a company and how sophisticated you were in defining your processes and decisions, but you need to feed those information into the agent.
I really like that important context of no computer is ever going to be held accountable. And I think this is one of the only thing that I would add, and I like the way that you framed it. So to the extent that no computer is held accountable, making sure that we're really discreet and very deliberate about what we delegate to them, recognizing that there's no legal consequence for the computer, but rather it's for the company. And I think this is a powerful reminder. Marc, I'm grateful for you spending the time today. And I am really appreciative of the conversation. And I wish you all the very best. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for having me. It was a great discussion. Appreciate it.
Likewise. And then for all of you watching, this has been another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. We'll see you next week.